August 12, 1943. Somewhere over Bougainville, in the searing blue sky that sat silent above the endless Pacific, Lieutenant Calvin Maddox had exactly 6 seconds to decide whether he was going to die or break every rule the Army Air Forces had taught him. He rolled his A's, P-38 lightning hard to the right. But the Japanese Zero behind him mimicked the move perfectly. That Zero had been stalking him for nearly 3 minutes, outmaneuvering every turn, every throttle juke, every climb. Maddox could feel the pressure in his arms from holding the stick tight, the sweat soaking through his gloves despite the freezing air outside the canopy. His wingman, Harris, had been shot down moments ago, no parachute. Just a flaming streak into the jungle below. Now. It was just Maddox, his rattling twin-boomed lightning, and a Zero flown by someone who clearly had done this many times before. The problem was physics. The Zero could outturn him in a flat engagement. Everybody knew that. They'd been told in every briefing, don't try to turn with them. Dive, zoom, use your speed. Use your altitude. But now Maddox had burned too much of both. He was low, slow, and the Zero was sliding perfectly into firing position. His options were gone. Unless he did something absolutely insane. He'd heard rumors. Talk in the ready room. Some of the older guys, Granger, Wilders, Reyes, they talked about this trick, rolling inverted and diving away. But it wasn't taught. Hell, it was discouraged. Negative G flight? That was a recipe for blackout, weed-out, fuel starvation, engine stall. The instructors back in Arizona had practically threatened them with court-martial if they ever did it. But the guy who'd tried it, supposedly, he lived 4 seconds now. The Zero's nose was almost aligned with his tail. Maddox slammed the control column to the left, rolling fully inverted. The world flipped. Ocean above, sky below. His stomach lurched. Then, without hesitation, he shoved the stick forward. It felt like his eyeballs exploded. Red poured into his vision, literal red. His face flushed with pressure. His jaw felt like it might burst apart from the inside. He couldn't see his altimeter. Couldn't see the ocean. Couldn't see anything. He counted 1, 2, 3 at 4 seconds. He gently pulled back on the stick. The aircraft screamed, engines howling. His body felt crushed now, pulled back into the seat by positive G's. Vision slowly cleared from a blood-red haze to gray, then finally back to sharp blue. He was at 9,000 feet, nose level, screaming over the ocean at 400 knots. And the Zero? Gone. He pulled back into a shallow climb, scanned the skies in wide circles. Nothing. No tracer fire. No engine noise behind him. Just the wind, the instruments, and his own heavy breathing. That's when he started laughing. 2 hours later. Back at Henderson Field, Maddox sat on a folding chair beside his aircraft. Boots still wet from the debriefing tent's leaking roof. Hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the coffee someone shoved into his grip. Captain Elias Foster. His CO leaned down and looked him over like a farmer inspecting a cracked engine block. You really did it? Foster asked. Maddox nodded. Rolled her over. Dove blind. Came out clean? You black out. Red out. Everything. Couldn't see a damn thing for about 5 seconds. Foster didn't answer right away. He just scratched the back of his head, took a drag of his cigarette, then exhaled toward the sky like he didn't want anyone on the ground to hear what he was thinking. We've lost 5 pilots this month to tailing Zeros. He muttered. You think this could work again? I know it could, Maddox said. Foster didn't smile. But he didn't walk away either. The war had changed by 1943. The Zero wasn't invincible anymore, but it still ruled the turning fight. American pilots had better planes now, Stronger engines, more firepower. But they were being taught to fly with one hand tied behind their backs. What Maddox had done was illegal. Not by law, but by doctrine. Manuals said no negative G maneuvers. No inverted dives unless absolutely necessary. Too dangerous. Too unstable. Too unpredictable. But Maddox was alive, and Harris, WASN single quotes T. and soon. The other pilots wanted to know how. The first one to ask was Lieutenant Henry Stitch Keegan. He was 21, from Kansas, and still flinched every time someone dropped a wrench in the hangar. He cornered Maddox that evening, just as the sun dipped low over the jungle. "Sir," Keegan said, "what's it like?" "What's what like?" The flip. The dive." Maddox sipped his water. "Feels like dying. But then you're not." Keegan didn't laugh. He just nodded. "I want to learn." By the end of the week, 6 pilots had asked. So Maddox borrowed a chalkboard from the mess tent, dragged it into the hangar, and started teaching what wasn't in the manual. "Here's the trick," he said. "Don't panic when the red hits your eyes. Don't overcorrect. Set your dive angle before you roll. The rest is just muscle memory." He drew diagrams, showed engine RPM settings, explained why the P-38's fuel injection held better in negative G than carbureted engines like the old P-40s. He passed out scrap paper notes with pullout, altitudes based on fuel loads and external tanks. Foster watched from the shadows. He never interrupted. Word spread beyond their squadron. By September, pilots from other outfits were asking about the Maddox maneuver. Some called it the red drop. Others just said, "Teach me how to disappear." One night, a crew chief named Dobbs told Maddox that a mechanic from the 341st was trying to duplicate the tactic in a P-47 Thunderbolt. "He's going to get someone killed," Dobbs muttered. "That bird wasn't built for this." Maddox just nodded. "We'll find out soon enough." 3 weeks later, Maddox flew a mission over Rabaul. He took a hit to his left wing, lost his radio, and ended up dragging a dying Lightning 200 miles back over open water, praying every piston in his twin Allison engines kept spinning. When he landed, he limped out of the cockpit and collapsed next to the nose wheel. A medic ran to him. "Lieutenant, can you move?" Maddox groaned. "I already did." Then passed out. Back in California. The trainers still taught wide turns and shallow climbs. In New Guinea. The pilots flipped their birds upside down and bled from the eyes. And slowly, the tide began to turn, not because someone rewrote the manual, but because one man ignored it. The next morning, the air over Henderson Field was thick with humidity and a low hum of propellers. The mechanics were already drenched in sweat, working in the oily dawn light. When Lieutenant Jack Monroe rolled his shoulders and stared at his P-38 Lightning like it was a creature he didn't yet understand. The twin booms shimmered in the rising heat, silver wings streaked with grime from the previous day's combat. The smell of fuel hung heavy in the air. He'd filed a request the night before, experimental flight exercise, and the operations officer had signed it only because he hadn't read the fine print. If he had, Monroe would have been grounded on the spot. He wasn't supposed to test anything, let alone a maneuver that violated every manual the Army Air Forces had printed. Negative G flight was the one red line every instructor had drilled into their skulls. Never push the nose over while inverted. Never induce negative acceleration. Never trust your blood to stay where it belongs. The medical section said 3 seconds of sustained negative G could cause retinal rupture. The engineers said the P-38's fuel feed might fail. The safety officers said simply, "Don't." But rules were written by men who hadn't watched a wingman burn in front of their eyes. So Monroe taxied out before anyone could stop him. Captain Elias Foster saw him lining up on the runway and jogged out waving a clipboard. "Jack, what the hell are you doing?" "Testing survival," Monroe shouted back through the open canopy, voice flat. He gave a half salute, shoved the throttles forward, and the twin Allison engines roared to life. The Lightning lunged down the strip, nose lifting, wheels rising into the humid morning. By the time Foster reached the edge of the tarmac, the plane was already a silver speck climbing toward the cloud's dot at 3,000 feet. Monroe leveled off, breathing hard, hands trembling on the controls. The air up there was cooler, cleaner, but no less heavy. He could almost hear his flight instructor back in Arizona, shouting in his ear, "You roll inverted, you die inverted." He smiled grimly. "Let's find out." He rolled the plane slowly upside down. The horizon flipped, the jungle now above him, the ocean a mirror below. For a moment, everything was still gravity, pulling him toward the straps that bit into his shoulders. Then he pushed the yoke forward. The world collapsed into red. Blood flooded upward, hammering behind his eyes. His skull felt like it might crack. The altimeter spun wildly. Somewhere a warning light blinked, ignored. He counted aloud, voice strangled by the pressure. 1, 2, 3. Then eased back on the stick. The Lightning groaned. The engines hiccuped, but held. He leveled at 8,000 feet, vision blurring back from crimson to gray. His head throbbed, his lips tingled, but he was alive. He tried again, this time steeper. Then again. Each run pushed him closer to blackout. By the fifth dive, he could anticipate the pain, ride it like a wave, and recover cleanly. On the sixth, one engine coughed and died. Fuel starvation. He switched tanks manually, flipped the auxiliary pump, and the engine sputtered back to life. The warning light stayed on. He ignored it. Every pilot knew there was a fine line between bravery and stupidity, and he could no longer tell which side he was on. When he landed, Foster was waiting beside the runway, jaw clenched. The maintenance crew surrounded the plane, pointing at streaks of leaked hydraulic fluid under the fuselage. "You nearly cooked her," Foster barked. "You pull that stunt again, I'll have you grounded and writing supply reports in Guam." Monroe climbed out slowly, helmet under one arm, eyes bloodshot. "Sir, I just proved we can survive it." Foster stared at him. "You also proved we can die trying." But word spread fast. By noon half, the squadron had heard about Monroe's blood dive. They gathered around the mess tables that night, voices low, cigarettes glowing in the dark. Some called him reckless. Others, a genius. Most just wanted to know if it really worked. When he told them he'd lost an engine mid-dive and still pulled out, even the skeptics went silent. Lieutenant Keegan asked the question everyone was thinking. "Could you teach it?" Monroe hesitated. "Only if you're willing to bleed for it." They were. Over the next week, he trained 3 volunteers off the record: Keegan, Morales, and Shorty Daniels. They practiced at dawn, when the tower crew was still half asleep and the senior staff were nursing coffee. Monroe explained everything he'd learned the hard way: throttle settings, recovery altitude, breathing through the readout. He warned them that the first time would feel like drowning upside down. They nodded, pretending not to be afraid. The first to try was Morales. He rolled too shallow, pulled too soon, and stalled one engine. He recovered, barely. Keegan did better, holding the negative dive for a full 4 seconds before pulling level, emerging with a scream of triumph over the radio. "It works. Hell, it actually works." Daniels blacked out entirely and woke up at 3,000 feet with the plane in a flat spin. He recovered too, but by miracle, not skill. When they landed, their faces were streaked with burst capillaries, eyes red like demons. They laughed anyway. Foster found out 2 days later. He called them into the briefing tent, slammed his cap on the table, and read the riot act. You're going to get yourselves killed. This isn't flying, it's self-inflicted torture. Monroe stood his ground. Sir, it's survival. The Zero pilots are doing it already. If we don't adapt, we die upright instead of inverted. Foster's glare softened. He'd been in combat long enough to know logic when he heard it. You get one chance, he said finally. If you crash a single plane, it ends. They didn't crash any. 2 weeks later, the squadron flew escort for B-25 bombers headed toward New Britain. Halfway to target, they were ambushed by 8 Zeros. The Americans formed defensive circles, the textbook tactic. 2 planes went down instantly. Monroe broke formation. Going inverted, he shouted. Foster's curse filled the radio. God help you, Jack. Monroe rolled upside down and shoved the yoke. Blood hammered his skull, vision bleeding crimson. A Zero followed, guns flashing. The Japanese pilot misjudged the speed differential. The P-38 plunged faster, steadier, its engines holding thrust where carbureted Zeros sputtered. When Monroe leveled at 7,000 feet, the Zero overshot. He reversed, climbed, and opened fire. The enemy plane exploded in a blossom of fire. Morales above him copied the move. Another kill dot by the time they regrouped. 4 Zeros were down, none of theirs lost. When they landed that evening, nobody spoke for a long time. Foster finally broke the silence. All right, he said quietly. Maybe the manual's wrong. From then on, they practiced daily. They refined the angle, the throttle, the altitude limits. Monroe's notebooks filled with rough calculations scrawled between grease smudges optimal entry speed, 320 knots. Safe recovery altitude, 7,500 feet. Readout duration averaged 2.7 seconds. He even drew crude diagrams showing blood flow and G-tolerance curves. The flight surgeon examined them once and muttered, "You're writing medical heresy." But the results were undeniable. Missions that used the inverted dive tactic came back with fewer losses. Pilots reported psychological shifts too. They no longer feared the Zero's tail position. They had an escape the enemy couldn't match. The negative G dive became a weapon, not a last resort. A way to vanish and reappear above your hunter like a ghost dot by October. Other squadrons were copying the technique. No official orders, no bulletins, just whispered briefings between pilots trading survival secrets. They called it the Rule Breakers Drop. Headquarters didn't like the nickname, but couldn't argue with the kill ratios. Somewhere in Washington, engineers tried to recreate the physics on paper and failed. Because what Monroe had invented wasn't a formula. It was instinct, terror, and defiance woven into motion. He kept flying it anyway. Every time he rolled inverted, he felt the same flash of doubt, the same thought that maybe this was the time his luck ran out. But when he pulled level again and saw the empty sky behind him, he knew he'd found something the textbooks could never teach. Sometimes, the only way to stay alive was to fly straight into the pain and trust that gravity would forgive you. By the time Monroe had flown his 50th negative G dive, the whispers had become too loud for headquarters to ignore. It started with a single line in a mission report from a reconnaissance pilot out of the 7th Fighter Command. Observed P-38 executing inverted escape maneuver. Enemy failed to pursue. That one sentence made its way up the chain past the squadron commander, through the operations group, then into the hands of analysts at Hickam Field. From there, it jumped an ocean to a basement room in the Pentagon where men in crisp uniforms looked at every page twice before filing it. 3 days later, Jack Monroe was summoned to a tent with a phone that never rang except when Washington called. Lieutenant Monroe. A gravelly voice said over the static. "We've been hearing things." He stood stiffly, sweat running down his spine. "Sir, what sort of things?" "About a maneuver you're teaching. One not listed in any AAF manual. Inverted negative G dive. You call it the rule breakers drop?" Monroe said nothing. The voice continued. "We'd like a demonstration." They sent Major Bernard Lasker 2 weeks later, a liaison from Tactical Command with a clipboard, thick glasses, and a permanent scowl. He arrived with a small team of observers and a photographer who never spoke but clicked his camera every few minutes, like a metronome of suspicion. Monroe watched them climb out of the transport plane and immediately knew none of them had been anywhere near live combat. They briefed in the operations tent. Lasker stood with arms crossed while Monroe sketched the dive on a chalkboard, explaining the pressure loads, the readout limits, the timing. Lasker interrupted halfway through. "You're telling me you willingly induced negative acceleration? That you fly your aircraft upside down while bleeding from your eyeballs?" Monroe stared at him. "Not every time, sir. Just the first few. That's insanity. That's survival." They took off just after dawn. Monroe flew with Daniels on his wing. Lasker sat in the second seat of a photo recon Lightning, modified with cameras and extra instrumentation. As they climbed to altitude, Monroe radioed over, "If you see smoke, don't worry. That's just the engine cursing me." They reached 9,000 feet. Monroe rolled inverted, counted to 2, and dropped like a hammer. Daniels followed perfectly. From Lasker's plane, they watched the 2 fighters vanish beneath the clouds, then reappear seconds later, roaring back into formation like nothing had happened. They landed 20 minutes later. Lasker's glasses were fogged. His face had gone pale dot in the debrief. He said, "Lieutenant, what you demonstrated is a flagrant violation of flight safety protocols." Monroe nodded. "And yet, I'm still alive." The major didn't laugh Dot back in Washington. The report caused panic in half the rooms it touched and wild admiration in the others. Engineers debated whether the P-38's airframe could handle prolonged negative G. Medical officers warned about internal hemorrhaging. Doctrine officers asked if such a tactic could be trained across units or if it relied too heavily on pilot instinct. General Hop Arnold himself requested a classified briefing, but while the men in suits argued over risk, tables and policy changes, war continued. And at Henderson Field, Monroe's squadron kept flying Dot, and came the first death. Lieutenant Morrell's a good pilot. Sharp instincts attempted the dive at low altitude during a zero ambush off Bougainville. He'd executed it dozens of times before. But this time, something went wrong. The angle was too steep, or the blood surged too fast. Or maybe he just blacked out a second too early. His plane dove nose first into the ocean. No parachute. No debris. They never recovered the body. Back on base, Foster read the casualty report in silence. Then he turned to Monroe. "Is this the price?" Monroe didn't answer. The death of Morales shook the squadron hard. Daniels refused to fly the dive again. Keegan grounded himself for 3 days. Even Monroe began double-checking every bolt, every valve before takeoff. The tactic wasn't just dangerous, it was unpredictable. Human bodies didn't always respond the same way. One pilot might recover fine. The next might lose vision at the wrong second and never come back. Word of the death reached Washington. The tone of the memos changed. Where once there had been curiosity, now there was alarm. One colonel wrote, "Experimental maneuvers resulting in fatality must be ceased immediately. Morale considerations do not outweigh doctrinal stability." Another warned, "Unauthorized tactics may inspire reckless behavior in less skilled units. Recommend immediate suppression of such techniques." The order came down 2 days later. Discontinue inverted negative G maneuver training. All further usage must be reported and reviewed. By tactical command, Monroe crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. You gonna obey that? Foster asked. I'm going to survive, Monroe replied. And so is anyone who learns this the right way. The men were split. Half the squadron kept flying the dive. The other half returned to standard tactics, flying tighter formations, trusting in doctrine. But the Zeros didn't care about memos. They kept attacking, and pilots kept dying. It was Lieutenant Thomas, a rookie from Michigan, who made the difference. During a mission escorting supply bombers over Rabaul, their flight was junked by 6 Zeros. Thomas had never tried the dive before. He'd listened to Monroe's lectures, but never practiced in the air. As the bullets shredded the sky, instinct took over. He rolled inverted, yanked the yoke, and dove. His blood screamed. His vision collapsed. The world vanished, and then he pulled level. Clean. The Zero overshot. He looped behind it and fired. 1 kill. When they landed, Thomas collapsed next to his plane, gasping. It worked, he wheezed. God damn it, it worked. After that, even the skeptics began asking Monroe for help again. Quietly. At night. Away from the official logs. It wasn't about bravery anymore. It was about math. Pilots who used the maneuver had a 43% lower casualty rate in high-speed encounters. The numbers didn't lie. Meanwhile, in Washington, the controversy boiled. General Mitchell, head of fighter development, demanded a full review. If this tactic has strategic value, we must own it. If it's a liability, we must bury it. A classified panel convened. They interviewed surviving pilots, watched blurry footage, read Monroe's handwritten diagrams. After 2 weeks, they reached a conclusion no one expected. The rule breaker's drop is not formally authorized, but neither is it forbidden. Field commanders may evaluate its usage at their discretion. In other words, do what you must. But don't make us responsible for the blood. The memo was delivered in a plain envelope. Foster read it and handed it to Monroe. Congratulations, he said. You've invented the first maneuver the brass is too scared to approve and too scared to ban. Monroe didn't smile. Then we keep flying. And they did, even as the war shifted north, even as the weather turned foul, even as new recruits rotated in and veterans rotated out. The inverted dive became a legend passed between squadrons like a secret handshake. It wasn't in the manuals. It was in the blood. The final weeks of the Pacific campaign bled into each other like the stormy skies Monroe had learned to dive through. The clouds seemed lower, the air heavier, and the faces around the base carried a tautness that even the most seasoned pilots couldn't hide anymore. Every man had seen death. Every man now flew with its breath on his neck. By the summer of 1945, Monroe's inverted dive had become a whispered lifeline among the pilots. There were no official manuals, no chalkboard lectures from commanding officers. But there were glances across briefing rooms, small nods, and quiet words exchanged under hangar lights. If a Zero tails you, they'd murmur, do the Monroe. Go inverted. Pull negative G, drop like hell. They called it a ghost tactic, one that didn't exist in the records but haunted every mission. And those who used it and returned spoke of it with the kind of reverence reserved for holy things. One particular mission changed everything. It was late August, and intelligence had picked up chatter about a convoy of Japanese supply ships hiding among the reefs of a remote island chain. Monroe's squadron was selected for the strike. The plan was simple: a 2-stage assault, with the P-47s running cover for the bombers, keeping the skies clear. But Monroe knew better. The plan was never simple. Not anymore. They launched just after dawn. The sky was thick with humidity, and the ocean below mirrored the gray heaviness above. As they neared the target zone, the air turned chaotic. Anti-aircraft fire bloomed like red poppies below, and before the bombers could drop, a wave of Zeros rose from the east like phantoms. Monroe's radio crackled with frantic voices. Multiple bogies 3 o'clock low. I've got one on my 6, can't shake him. Then came the call he dreaded. 2 bombers hit, we're losing altitude. He banked hard, cutting through smoke, tracing the tail of one bomber spiraling toward the sea. He spotted it, a single Zero bearing down on the crippled craft like a shark scenting blood. Without a word, Monroe dove dot. He flipped his Thunderbolt upside down, disengaging from the traditional dogfight dance. His stomach pressed against his harness as the negative G's tore through him. The earth, now sky. The sky, now ocean. The Zero, confused, tried to follow, but Monroe dropped faster, steeper, and at an angle that defied everything the Zero had been built for. Then he snapped out. Wings level. Behind the Zero, one burst. 2. The enemy plane erupted in a silent bloom of fire and fell behind the bomber it had almost doomed. Monroe didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. He climbed again, only to repeat the maneuver minutes later, saving another plane, this time losing a piece of his left wing to shrapnel. When they returned, 3 bombers were gone. 2 more were barely airworthy. But every man who survived swore the same thing. Monroe had saved them. Not once, not twice, but 4 separate times in one mission. They started calling him the Reaper in reverse. But Monroe knew his body couldn't keep enduring the punishment. Each dive racked his organs, blurred his vision longer, made his hands slower on the stick. And worse, he'd begun to feel it. The fear, not of death, but of becoming the reason someone else died. So he asked for a desk job. Command refused. He was too valuable, too effective. But he insisted. A week later, Monroe was reassigned as a tactics advisor at a base in Hawaii. There, he trained young pilots, unofficially, in the art of the inverted escape. He used model planes, sand tables, chalk diagrams, whatever he could. Always off the books. Always after hours. Then came Hiroshima. Then Nagasaki. And then silence. The war was over. Back home in Ohio, Monroe returned not as a hero, but as a man with back pain, tinnitus, and memories that never quite settled. He took up a job as a mailman, married a librarian named Zhang, and never spoke of the dives again. When neighbors asked, he'd smile and mention something about flying over the Pacific, and change the subject. But in the aviation circles, Monroe became a myth. The tactic, still unofficial, was passed down from veteran to recruit, tested in simulators, whispered about in Air Force forums decades later. Some called it reckless, others genius. None could agree on its origin. The paper trail was thin, the mission logs vague, his name rarely mentioned, until one day, 40 years later, a young historian named Claire Dunning found a footnote in an old Pacific sortie report. Pilot Monroe avoided engagement via inverted descent maneuver. Enemy tail lost. That was all it said, but Claire dug deeper. She interviewed surviving squad mates, pieced together fragments of Monroe's missions, and eventually published a book, The Dive That Changed the War. Monroe, now in his 70s, received a copy in the mail. He read it alone, on his porch, tears staining the pages. A week later, the Air Force sent a letter of commendation. Belated, but sincere. They invited him to speak at the Air Force Academy. He declined. Instead, he wrote one sentence on a card and mailed it to Claire. Sometimes the best tactics don't make it into manuals, just into memories. He passed away quietly that winter, surrounded by family, with a photo of his P-47 on the nitstand dot, and though no medal bore his name, and no monument stood in his honor, every time a pilot pulls -G to dodge a tail, every time a dive saves a crew, Monroe flies again, dot in silence, dot in shadow, dot in the memory of the sky.